Today what I want to talk about is really about digital communication. How long we're actually going to keep on using laptops. Because increasingly they are interoperable, interlinked, and actually indispensable. I have to say then, at that point, if I lose the mobile phone, I'm in real trouble. One of the key things that, of course, all this mobile communication that we have in our laptops enables us to do is to work 24/7. We can be on call 24/7. And as leaders, that puts us under quite a lot of pressure. It also means, of course, that we can monitor our employees 24/7. And that raises some interesting and slightly worrying concerns, particularly amongst those employees. The key thing, though, is that this has become a personal micro world. And it's one that's very comfortable. It's one we dive into at every opportunity. I've got a lady on the front row here who's actually dived into it at the moment. And obviously, as a speaker, my job is to get her out of it, but she hasn't noticed so far. It is very comfortable because it's a world that we've created. It's a world that we use as corporations because it means we can contact people. It means we can network with people. It means we can access data 24/7. We like it. I think, I'm not entirely sure that whether or not we actually like it too much. Because this personal micro world that we're in is very absorbing. It's very comfortable. And of course, you've only got to go onto a bus or a train or into a restaurant and you see everybody absorbed in it. So, how is it affecting us as individuals in the way we communicate? Well, one of the things that it's doing, I'm going to suggest to you, is that it makes us go inward. It makes us get absorbed in our personal world, and that may not be such a good thing. As we're drawn in, we are increasingly focused on what's happening in it, possibly to the extent of what's happening around us, which can lead to some disastrous results, as this accident a few weeks ago in the UK, where a lorry driver was talking on his mobile phone and ploughed into the back of a whole bunch of cars that had a family in it, and they were all killed. So this move away from reality to actually our created reality in our mobile phones is not always a good thing. But one thing is certain, and I was talking about this to the chairman of one of Britain's biggest companies just a couple of weeks ago. And we agreed between us that actually what this amounts to is the biggest unplanned social experiment in the history of the world. Because it changes all of us and how we interact. And there's nobody in charge of the plan. Introspective. And in some ways, more reactive, because we react to what we see in the social media and to messages that we get on our phone all the time. When we introduce the technology, we find that the isolation from being actually communicating with people around us can affect our own confidence in communication when we meet new people. We actually prefer sitting in the bus rather than having to talk to somebody, getting into our own little world. It means that we're closed down. People don't want to talk to us. Now, if we take that even further and let's see where technology is going, here we are on a roller coaster experience, except it's a virtual roller coaster. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been to Disneyland Paris. I did some of their launch communications for them. And roller coasters are good fun. When you're all on board the roller coaster and you're all enjoying the experience, and you're all sharing the screaming and the fear, and you're interacting with each other. In this, of course, you're not interacting with each other. You're interacting purely with a virtual reality that has been created for you by a programmer. Which made me wonder whether or not the virtual reality that we create in here is also susceptible to being created by others. We are influenced by others through the use of social media. And if we are only mixing with people, our own community on here, who are like-minded people, we're not being challenged. Of course, we don't like challenge, we don't like change, so that's why this is comfortable. But it may not be a great thing, particularly if we're leaders of an organization and our audience, our stakeholders, our employees are people who we want to challenge, who we want them to challenge us, because we want to introduce change. Why? Because the world is changing around us, and staying still and doing the same thing is not what you appoint a leader for. You appoint a leader to take your organization or your team from where they are now and to improve the situation, to grow the business, to grow the people. So it does raise questions about, if we're living in a virtual world, whether or not that audience is actually can be led as easily as perhaps past audiences could, when perhaps 10 or 20 years ago we were much easier about interacting with each other in the real world. So, you know, you can see it even in the park. A couple of young lovers, and actually they're more interested in the mobile phone, or in this case posing for a picture, than they are actually in each other and their company. What it means is that we become less practiced in human-to-human communication. We become more individual, perhaps more defensive of the people who are connected within our own little micro world. There is, of course, another danger, which is quite easy to see with young children, who, according to a recent survey in the UK, something like 75% of children were arriving at school overtired because they've been checking the social media during the night. But of course, what they're checking on social media doesn't have any checks itself. So it means that potentially they become more addicted, more susceptible, more isolated in their own worlds, and particularly more vulnerable, perhaps, to disinformation, misinformation. And cyberbullying is, of course, a major issue amongst school children today. Generally, though, this thing, because we're connected all the time, and because we get so much information, because we have access to it, time is precious. We value our time, and we're actually quite protective of it. So how does that manifest itself? Well, if you look at websites, as you can see, those people around here who have website designers working for them will know that websites are becoming more visual. They're becoming more superficial, because that's what the audiences want. They don't want the depth. One of the successes, of course, is the rise of the comparison site. So if you have a need for new car insurance or home insurance, or you want to take out a loan, you actually don't have to trawl around every individual bank, every individual insurance company. You can put in your key criteria and you just get the headlines. And you choose, well, you know, what's the basic product that I need at the best possible price? It's very superficial. But perhaps you're missing, with this superficiality, some of the depth you need to make the informed decision. So that can be dangerous. If we look at email, I don't know about you, but I think most people these days would say they are overloaded with email. And what happens is, of course, because email has always been a great way, ever since it was invented, a great way of communicating, it's become overused. We get bombarded. I actually end up deleting about 98% of the emails I receive. And a lot of those are deleted automatically by my spam filters. And these messages aimed at me actually just end up going straight into the trash can. And it's an increasing problem with business today. It means that, in fact, we don't even bother reading the email most of the time. What we do is we look at, are we going to be engaged by the strapline on the email? And are we also probably going to check who sent it to us? If it's a familiar name, or the strapline says something that is relevant to us, we might bother to read the email. But if not, it stands a good chance of ending up in the recycle bin. So what people have done is, if they want to now connect with you, they try to connect direct by getting into your community of contacts. And so they connect with you on things like Twitter, use social media to get to you direct. But that's all very well, but the communication that you're getting is quite limited to the constraints of 140 characters. So once again, it's very superficial. It allows you to comment, but does it allow you to communicate? Remember, communication is a two-way thing, and human-to-human communication should be about grabbing the hearts and the minds of people, moving their souls, because when you communicate, you want an audience to move from where you start to where you want them to be at the end of. It can be a two-way discussion, it can be a presentation, it can be what I'm doing now, which is a speech. In effect, though, as we connect more and more on things like LinkedIn, we end up creating what I would suggest to you could be described as a digital ghetto. The definition of a ghetto obviously being a lot of like-minded people or people who have very similar views or background who actually all live together because it's comfortable, they like living together. And that's what we create, a digital ghetto in our digital world. And we get really absorbed by it. We get very protective of it. If you want to see how protective of it, if any of you have got teenage children, try asking them to come down for lunch when they're in the middle of communicating with their friends, and they get quite angry. I know my son does. But of course, being in there, being in this world, is very agreeable, it's very comfortable, and we like being there. But these things are really powerful because they have lots of other apps on them which allow you to measure things, acceleration, braking. In fact, in the UK now, we've got apps that insurance companies put out that enable them to check on how you're driving and to adjust your insurance premium on your car according to what your phone has detected about your driving. Scary? Yeah, I find it scary. But then anybody who's been driven by me normally finds it scary too. Not only can they work out the acceleration and deceleration, they can work out how energetic you've been, how many steps you've taken when you're walking. I mean, I know they're called fitness apps, but actually they're measuring your movement, how many steps you've run, your positioning. They can work out exactly where you've been, which is fantastic. It creates lots of big data, and big companies can use it very effectively. So, for instance, if you use that big data with a company like DHL, okay, who are delivering parcels, it's fantastic. You can get all the data to work out where your parcel is. If you're the customer, through the website, you can see where your parcel is, who's delivering it, what time it's coming, whether or not it's going to be delayed. It makes life so much easier. And of course, for DHL, it means that they can very easily track whether or not their driver is driving efficiently, whether or not they're keeping to schedule, and whether or not they need retraining. Now, they're not the only big company doing it. If you look at a company like Amazon, massive warehouses, stock pickers who actually, many of them run around on roller skates because they need to get from point A to point B so quickly. And they take around their digital equipment, and they're able to make sure that they can see what they're picking off the shelf, whether or not it's the right shelf, how quickly they spend time there, and how quickly they can then leave and go on to pick up the next item of stock, which is fantastic if you want to improve people's performance, providing you use that information and you communicate why you're using that information very clearly, and there is a mutual contract between employer and employee. Because if you don't have the mutual contract, it can be a bit like you're being watched. The mentality of the employee is that Big Brother is watching you, checking your every move. And that changes how you feel about your employer, because it breaks the trust. So unless you've communicated clearly about why you're doing it, there is a danger that, in fact, such technology can be used to put people under pressure, even when they're ill or tired and they're not performing well. Will a fall off in performance mean they are taken in for a talk or retraining? Or in the worst case situation, they might, of course, even find they're being sacked. Because in the UK, most Amazon employees are on what they call 0 hours contract. So they only call you in when they want you, and they can send you back when they don't. There's no long-term employer obligation. Now, it's fantastic for the company because, of course, you can reduce costs and you can improve efficiency. But this whole issue of trust is absolutely essential. And it falls upon the leaders to therefore communicate very clearly and to create this contract between employee and employer. It also means that leaders need to move into a style of communication that moves away from telling, a top-down style, into more one that is about coaching, helping use that data to bring people forward, to help improve their performance by mutual agreement. Now, a good example of what we mean is, say, in the Formula One teams, because, of course, every car and every driver is completely wired up, and they get vast quantities of big data. I don't know if any of you have ever been into one of the Formula One team headquarters, but they have rooms that are bigger than this entire floor of this building, full of mega computers that are analyzing all the data all the time. And of course, the driver knows that every time they take their foot off the accelerator or put their foot on, or every steering movement or every button they press is being monitored. But that's okay, because there is a mutual agreement that they all want to find the incremental gains so they win the championship. So if we use the data in a responsible way and we respect each other and we have a mutual contract, it's actually okay. But what if we don't? Well, if you think about how people react generally if there is a negative change on the horizon, what do? Well, we've had a few negative changes in the UK, with various campaigns. We've had Brexit. There's an environmental campaign there as well. What we tend to do is we research data. So we use these things to research. What are the facts? So we can find out whether or not the decision to make a change is justified. So we test our leaders. And having done the research, we can then look for mutual support from other like-minded people on our networks. We can tweet, we can use social media to attract a campaign and turn it into a movement. Of course, one of the things very difficult to do using digital media is to actually argue with people. Arguing is kind of best done face-to-face if you want to have an argument, but this is not a great way of arguing. So it seems strange that sometimes people try to use it that way. And certainly I've been called in to situations as a consultant when, say, at Stafford Hospital in the UK, which was named as, actually incorrectly named as the worst hospital in the UK, the people of Stafford protested at changes to the hospital. And it went from, not that it was the worst hospital in the UK, but they started supporting it because they realized that in fact they could lose their hospital. It ended up with a protest camp and actually even calls to occupy the hospital, so to actually challenge the authorities. Now that was an interesting one to work with, but more commonly, and it is becoming more common, people can use this because communication becomes so easy to withdraw your labor and challenge leadership. It's becoming much easier to do that, because this is a virtual world in which we are being trained to be more reactive. Of course, you could say, well, okay, that's in a company, but if you look at an advanced society like Europe, Europe has become generally more defensive and reactive as well. You've only got to look at the reaction to the Syrian refugee crisis, and Europe put up its walls, Donald Trump style, dare I say, and stopped people with real need who were trying to escape a war from being safe. So if Europe, there's a good cartoon there, we need a bigger moat. I thought the Mediterranean was big enough, but hey-ho. Donald Trump in America, same thing. It's all about building walls. We are building the walls because we're feeling that we need to protect what we have. We're going to make America great again, he tells us. He doesn't tell us how, but he tells us he's going to do it. And we're going to hide behind the wall that we put up. But the problem with walls is that you may feel safe behind them, but you lose the perspective on what's happening outside. You lose the ability to understand what are the changes that are actually ultimately going to affect you and your economy and your jobs. And you're going to lose a lot of the opportunities if you close down and build walls. So for me, this entire psychology, this psychological experiment that's going on, where we are being moved into a position of being more defensive and reactive and more protective, is not a healthy one. Of course, we've had Brexit in the UK, leave Britain. That was an interesting one, because the moment actually people voted for it, and we said to the leaders of it, okay, you've won. We may not have agreed with you, but now, are you going to put that money that you're going to save from Europe into the National Health Service, into our hospitals? And they went, well, no, that was just a campaign claim. Because actually, political advertising in the UK doesn't have to comply with the Advertising Standards Authority, the regulator. So nobody holds political advertising to account, which means anybody can say anything. Now, here's something interesting. That means that if you use Facebook or Twitter, you can say whatever you like because there's no regulator. And obviously, the bigger the statement you make, the more outrageous the statement, the easier it is to go viral. So perhaps, subconsciously, we're being led into a situation where we're making more outrageous statements, saying more outrageous things, so we get more attention. If I go back to Donald Trump, of course, he actually did this very effectively because he was challenged by the media. Well, how are you going to make America great again? What do you mean by making America great again? When did you ever think it was great in the first place? What was great about it? Well, he didn't like those sorts of questions. So he actually abandoned the mainstream media and took to Facebook. And 66% of Americans access their news on Facebook. Except, of course, Facebook, there is no editorial control on Facebook, so much the same problem arises. You can say anything, and the more outrageous, the better if you want it to go viral. And he did that very successfully. So here's two examples where, in effect, democracy has been hijacked. Hijacked by illusions of spin and by very carefully worked out campaigns that use social media and digital media to access us as individuals through our mobile digital worlds, our micro worlds. So how can we actually, as leaders, rethink how we communicate with an audience that, frankly, demands superficial communication so they can understand things quickly and easily? They don't want to work too hard. Well, we've got some examples of how we motivate people, and motivating people is very much through, the sort of thing that we can see happening in football. In football, coaches go out to motivate, and they do it best human to human. So if we look at how Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, professor at MIT in Boston, describes the interaction between society, government, and industry, and the interaction that happens to guide what is known as the bewildered herd, or society, they all tend to use media because that's where society goes. These days, of course, social media is even more popular. So if you can influence people through social media, and that also these days influences the media themselves, That's why there's a great deal of competition to get into both social media and media. For us as leaders, we need to use our coaching skills. We need to think about not just telling people. We've got to move away from telling people. We've got to move to actually using what I would call an integrated, holistic approach, where we listen to people. I was always told at school, you have 2 ears, Warwick, and 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio. It's echoed by something the Dalai Lama said, which I'm sure some of you may have seen, but it's worth repeating. When you talk, you're only repeating what you already know. But when you listen, you may learn something new. And leaders have got to listen better. Now, the good news is that by monitoring social media and monitoring the media, you can use this to listen more effectively. So my proposition to you is that actually we use an integrated and holistic approach, which combines human-to-human communication with digital media, but the digital part should start with listening before we use it to communicate outwards. I had to use this approach recently at a hospital in the UK, which had a big problem with engagement of its staff, particularly their doctors and nurses, their medical staff. Now, the problem there was they'd done a quantitative survey. They'd got quantitative data that said, you're the worst hospital for staff engagement. What we did is we went in with investigative interviewers who sat down and spent half an hour with each member of medical staff. And after 2 months of listening to doctors and nurses complain, but tell us what their issues were, we produced a report compiling it all. What was fantastic about that was that it brought out 3 benefits. 1, it meant that the doctors and nurses felt they had been listened to. Not just that they'd been listened to, but they felt they'd been listened to, because we were using high-level listening skills. 2, it created a list of all their suggestions, which actually turned into an instant change plan that the hospital could use. And 3, another great side effect is it very rapidly identified their own solutions that included several that delivered over £1 million worth of savings within the first 3 months of being implemented. Now, that's quite a stunning result, but it's there for the taking. So that's where we were combining then at the end of it all of these things into a report, which we communicated through digital media back to the very people we'd interviewed, so they knew they'd been listened to and they felt appreciated. But this human-to-human communication is absolutely fundamental, and I do recommend it. It's worth just reminding ourselves that your businesses don't have emotions, that your products don't have emotions, but your people do. Therefore, we need to come back and remember that when we're using digital communication and social media. I was recently sent this email by the Estonian government. I happened, through having an interesting little card like this, which enables me to communicate digitally and digitally sign documents with key institutions in Estonia. It's their e-citizen card, and it capitalizes on the ability of their digital infrastructure, which is quite advanced, to allow e-citizens. It doesn't give you a right of residency, but it allows you to have these high-level communications that are secure. And what they said was, okay, in England, you've got a problem. Businesses are worried about Brexit. Why not come and relocate your business to Estonia? You don't have to be here, because you can do it remotely using your e-citizen card. And for 190 euros, we'll help you set up a company and open a bank account so that you can then run a company inside Europe after Britain has exited. Great opportunity had been spotted by the Estonians, and they capitalized on it by getting hold of quite a hard-to-reach bunch of global individuals, including the Japanese Prime Minister, who also has one of these cards, and got their messages out. So, as I come to a summary, just remember that we are connected, but you need to use the digital connections carefully, and you must never forget the human element of it. And any business can do it. And in Ukraine, you've got some fantastic assets, things that you can use to get out there and use a digital economy to really give you a big advance. So I would recommend that you do it before anybody else steps into the space and does it. Because the other thing that I found out over many years is that if you don't communicate, somebody else will, and it may be somebody else filling the gap with quite negative, reinforcing negative stereotypes, putting in propaganda that don't work in your favor. I think you've got a few examples of that in eastern Ukraine at the moment. So get in there, get communicating, but above all, get listening and make sure that people understand that. We're in a connected world, and I would suggest to you that in terms of strategic leadership, we've never had so many tools at our fingertips. We've never been so connected. We've never had so many opportunities, and we've never been so able to deliver a great future. I recommend it to you. Thank you very much indeed. Дякую.